Henry Louis Stimson was an American statesman whose career spanned more than half a century and whose influence shaped the nation through 2 world wars and the dawn of the atomic age. Born on September 21, 1867 in New York City, Stimson came from privilege and education, yet he would dedicate his life to public service with a sense of duty and moral conviction that defined an entire generation of American leaders. He was a man of principle in an age that demanded difficult choices, and his decisions would help determine the course of the 20th century. Stimson was born into an old and respected New York family. His father, Louis Atterbury Stimson, was a prominent surgeon and professor of medicine. His mother, Candace Wheeler Stimson, came from a distinguished family with deep roots in American history. Young Henry grew up in an environment of education, culture, and social responsibility. The Stimsons were part of New York's Protestant elite, a class that believed wealth and position carried obligations to serve the broader society. When Henry was 8 years old, his mother died, a loss that profoundly affected him throughout his life. His father remarried, but the boy never fully recovered from losing his mother at such a young age. The experience may have contributed to the reserved and somewhat formal personality he developed. Even as an adult, Stimson was known for his emotional restraint and his difficulty expressing personal feelings. Stimson received the finest education available to a young man of his class and era. He attended Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, one of the nation's most prestigious preparatory schools. There he excelled academically and developed the habits of discipline and study that would serve him throughout his career. He was not a natural athlete, but he forced himself to participate in sports, believing that physical activity built character and toughness. In 1884, Stimson entered Yale University, where he continued his academic excellence. He studied history and political science, subjects that fascinated him and shaped his worldview. At Yale, he was elected to Skull and Bones, the secret society that brought together the university's elite students. The connections he made at Yale would prove valuable throughout his career. He graduated in 1888 near the top of his class and with a reputation as a serious and capable young man. After Yale, Stimson attended Harvard Law School, considered the finest legal training available in America. He studied under some of the leading legal minds of the era and absorbed the principles of law and justice that would guide his public service. He graduated from Harvard Law in 1890 and was admitted to the New York bar. He joined a prestigious Wall Street law firm and began what promised to be a lucrative career in corporate law. Stimson proved to be an excellent lawyer. He had a sharp analytical mind, meticulous attention to detail, and the ability to master complex legal issues. He worked on major corporate cases and earned a substantial income. By the standards of his time and class, he was on track for a successful and comfortable life as a corporate attorney. But Stimson wanted more than financial success. He felt a calling to public service. In 1893, Stimson married Mabel Wellington White, a woman from a prominent Connecticut family. The marriage was happy and enduring, lasting until Mabel's death in 1949. They had no children, which was a disappointment to both of them, but they built a life together based on shared values and mutual respect. Mabel supported Henry's public service career even when it meant financial sacrifice and long separations. Stimson's entry into public service came in 1906, when President Theodore Roosevelt appointed him United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. At 38 years old, Stimson left his lucrative law practice to become a federal prosecutor. The position paid a fraction of what he had been earning, but it offered the opportunity to serve the public interest. As U.S. Attorney, Stimson made his reputation fighting corruption and corporate fraud. He prosecuted customs fraud cases, antitrust violations, and political corruption with equal vigor. He believed that the law should apply equally to rich and poor, powerful and weak. His most famous case was the prosecution of the American Sugar Refining Company for customs fraud. The case was complex and politically sensitive, but Stimson pursued it relentlessly. Though he did not win every case, he established himself as an honest and capable public servant who could not be intimidated or bought. Stimson's success as U.S. Attorney brought him to the attention of Republican Party leaders. In 1910, he was persuaded to run for governor of New York. It was a difficult race in a year that favored Democrats, and despite a vigorous campaign, Stimson lost. The defeat was painful and he briefly returned to private law practice, but his taste for public service had been whetted and he remained active in Republican politics. In 1911, President William Howard Taft appointed Stimson as Secretary of War. At 43, he became responsible for the entire United States Army at a time when the military was small and underfunded. Stimson worked to modernize and professionalize the Army, improving training, equipment, and organization. He believed that America needed a strong military even in peacetime, a view that was not universally shared in an era when many Americans were isolationist. When Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, was elected president in 1912, Stimson left office and returned once again to private law practice. He joined a prominent New York firm and resumed his corporate legal work. but he continued to follow international affairs closely and became increasingly concerned about the growing tensions in Europe. When World War I erupted in 1914, Stimson believed that America would eventually be drawn into the conflict. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, Stimson was nearly 50 years old, far too old for combat service, but he was determined to serve. He obtained a commission as an artillery officer and went to France with the American Expeditionary Force. He served as a colonel of artillery, commanding a unit in combat operations. His service was brief, as the war ended in November 1918, but it demonstrated his commitment to the principle that those who advocate for war must be willing to fight in it. After the war, Stimson returned to New York and his law practice. Throughout the 1920s, he was one of New York's most prominent attorneys, handling major cases and earning a substantial income. But he remained interested in public affairs and was frequently consulted by Republican leaders on questions of policy and strategy. He was particularly interested in international relations and became an advocate for American engagement with the world. In 1927, President Calvin Coolidge sent Stimson to Nicaragua as a special envoy to mediate a civil war. Stimson successfully negotiated a peace agreement and supervised elections that ended the conflict. His diplomatic success in Nicaragua enhanced his reputation as a skilled negotiator and problem solver. He demonstrated an ability to understand complex political situations and find practical solutions. In 1929, President Herbert Hoover appointed Stimson as Secretary of State. At 61, Stimson became America's chief diplomat at a critical moment in world history. The Great Depression was beginning, international tensions were rising, and the post-World War I order was showing signs of strain. As Secretary of State, Stimson faced numerous challenges. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, violating international law and threatening the stability of East Asia. Stimson responded by articulating what became known as the Stimson Doctrine, declaring that the United States would not recognize territorial changes made by force. It was a moral stance that had limited practical effect, as America lacked the military power or political will to enforce it, but it established an important principle. Stimson also worked on arms control, supporting the London Naval Treaty of 1930, which sought to limit naval armaments among the major powers. He believed that arms control could reduce international tensions and prevent war. He was disappointed when the treaty system began to break down in the mid-1930s as nations rearmed in response to growing threats. When Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat, was elected president in 1932, Stimson left office for what he thought would be the final time. He was 65 years old and ready to retire. He returned to his law practice and his estate on Long Island, where he enjoyed gardening, horseback riding, and the company of friends. He wrote articles on foreign policy and remained engaged with international affairs, but he expected his public career was over. The rise of Nazi Germany and the growing threat of war in Europe troubled Stimson deeply. He watched with alarm as Adolf Hitler rearmed Germany, violated treaties, and threatened neighboring countries. He became convinced that the United States would eventually have to confront the Nazi threat. He was critical of American isolationism and argued that the nation needed to prepare for war. In June 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt made a remarkable decision. With war raging in Europe and the presidential election approaching, Roosevelt appointed two prominent Republicans to his cabinet. Stimson, at age 72, was named Secretary of War, and Frank Knox became Secretary of the Navy. It was an unprecedented move designed to create a bipartisan government of national unity as the country prepared for the possibility of war. Stimson accepted the appointment out of a sense of duty. He believed that the Nazi threat required all Americans to put aside partisan politics and work together. He also believed that his experience and knowledge were needed at this critical moment. Despite his age and his preference for retirement, he could not refuse the call to serve. As Secretary of War for the second time, Stimson faced an enormous task. The United States Army in 1940 was small, poorly equipped, and unprepared for modern warfare. Stimson had to oversee a massive military buildup, expanding the army from fewer than 200,000 men to millions. He had to supervise the construction of training camps, the production of weapons and equipment, and the development of strategy for a global war. Stimson proved to be an effective administrator despite his age. He worked long hours, mastered complex details, and made difficult decisions. He was a demanding boss who expected excellence from his subordinates. He assembled a talented team of military officers and civilian administrators, including George Marshall, whom Stimson considered one of the finest military minds in American history. One of Stimson's most controversial decisions was his support for peacetime conscription. In 1940, with war raging in Europe but the United States still at peace, Stimson argued that America needed to draft men into military service. The proposal was deeply unpopular, but Stimson believed it was necessary. He lobbied Congress vigorously, and in September 1940 the Selective Service Act was passed, establishing the first peacetime draft in American history. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, bringing the United States into World War II, Stimson was 74 years old. He would serve as Secretary of War throughout the entire conflict, one of the oldest cabinet members in American history to hold such a demanding position. The strain was enormous, but Stimson never faltered. During the war, Stimson was involved in virtually every major strategic decision. He worked closely with President Roosevelt and with military commanders to plan operations in Europe and the Pacific. He oversaw the expansion of the army to over 8 million men. He supervised the production of vast quantities of weapons and equipment. He dealt with personnel issues, strategic planning, and the countless administrative details of running a global war. Stimson also faced difficult moral and legal questions. One of the most painful was the internment of Japanese Americans. In early 1942, following Pearl Harbor, there was widespread fear of Japanese sabotage and espionage on the West Coast. Military commanders and West Coast politicians demanded that all persons of Japanese ancestry be removed from coastal areas. Stimson initially had doubts about the necessity and constitutionality of mass internment, but he ultimately supported the decision. Over 110,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in internment camps. It was one of the greatest civil liberties violations in American history, and Stimson later expressed regret for his role in it. Another difficult issue was the strategic bombing of Germany and Japan. As the war progressed, Allied bombing became increasingly destructive, targeting not just military installations but entire cities. The firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo killed tens of thousands of civilians. Stimson was troubled by the moral implications of area bombing, but he accepted the military argument that destroying enemy industrial capacity and morale was necessary to win the war. The most momentous decision Stimson faced was the use of the atomic bomb. In 1945, after years of secret development under the Manhattan Project, the United States possessed a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. Stimson chaired the committee that advised President Harry Truman on whether and how to use the bomb against Japan. The decision weighed heavily on him. He understood that the atomic bomb would kill enormous numbers of civilians and would change warfare forever. He considered various alternatives, including a demonstration of the bomb's power or a warning to Japan before its use. Ultimately, Stimson supported using the atomic bomb against Japanese cities. He believed that it would end the war quickly and save American lives that would be lost in an invasion of Japan. He also believed that a demonstration of the bomb's power would convince Japan to surrender and might prevent future wars by showing the terrible consequences of modern warfare. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, killing approximately 70,000 people instantly. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15, ending World War II. The atomic bombings remain controversial to this day. Stimson defended the decision for the rest of his life, arguing that it saved lives overall by ending the war without an invasion of Japan. Critics argued that Japan was already defeated and would have surrendered without the atomic bombs, making their use unnecessary and immoral. Stimson wrestled with the moral implications of the decision, but he never expressed public regret. After Japan's surrender, Stimson resigned as Secretary of War. He was 78 years old and exhausted from 5 years of wartime service. On September 21, 1945, his 78th birthday, he left office for the final time. President Truman awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor, for his service. Stimson retired to his estate on Long Island, where he finally had the leisure he had long postponed. He wrote his memoirs with the help of George Bundy, a young scholar who would later become a prominent foreign policy advisor. The memoirs, published in 1947 under the title On Active Service in Peace and War, provided Stimson's account of his long career and defended his major decisions, including the use of the atomic bomb. In retirement, Stimson remained interested in public affairs. He supported the creation of the United Nations and the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. He advocated for international control of atomic weapons, believing that nuclear proliferation posed an existential threat to humanity. He argued that the United States should share atomic secrets with the Soviet Union under international supervision, a position that was controversial in the emerging Cold War. Stimson's health declined in his final years. He suffered from heart problems and other ailments related to his advanced age. But his mind remained sharp, and he continued to read, write, and receive visitors. He maintained correspondence with former colleagues and followed international developments closely. On October 20, 1950, Henry Stimson died at his home in Huntington, Long Island. He was 83 years old. The cause of death was heart failure. His funeral was attended by military leaders, government officials, and friends from his long career. He was buried in a private ceremony befitting his reserved personality. Stimson's legacy is that of a dedicated public servant who placed duty above personal interest. He served his country in various capacities over 5 decades, always guided by a strong sense of moral responsibility. He was not a charismatic leader or a brilliant innovator, but rather a capable administrator and a man of principle who made difficult decisions in difficult times. His greatest contributions were his leadership during World War II and his role in building the American military establishment. The modern Department of Defense owes much to the organizational structures and principles that Stimson established. His insistence on civilian control of the military, professional military education, and merit-based promotion helped create the most effective military force in history. Stimson represented a particular type of American leader, the Eastern establishment patrician who believed that privilege carried obligations. He could have lived a comfortable life as a wealthy lawyer, but he chose instead to serve the public. He accepted positions that paid poorly and demanded enormous effort because he believed it was his duty. Modern historians recognize Stimson as one of the most important American statesmen of the 20th century. His influence on American foreign and defense policy was profound and lasting. The principles he articulated, civilian control of the military, international engagement, collective security, continue to shape American policy today. The decision to use the atomic bomb remains the most controversial aspect of Stimson's legacy. Historians continue to debate whether it was necessary and whether alternatives existed. Stimson himself understood the gravity of the decision and its implications for the future. He hoped that the horror of nuclear weapons would make future wars unthinkable, though he feared that humanity might not have the wisdom to avoid nuclear catastrophe. Stimson's life spanned an era of extraordinary change in American history. Born just 2 years after the Civil War, he lived to see America become a global superpower. He witnessed the transformation of warfare from cavalry charges to atomic weapons. He participated in that transformation and helped shape it according to his principles of duty, honor, and service. In the end, Henry Stimson was neither a perfect man nor without flaws. His support for Japanese internment was a serious moral failing. His views on race and class reflected the prejudices of his time and background. But he was a man who dedicated his life to public service and who faced the most difficult decisions with courage and conviction. His legacy includes his contributions to American military power, his influence on generations of public servants, and his example of duty and dedication. He is remembered today as one of the great American statesmen, a man who served his country faithfully through peace and war, guided always by his sense of moral responsibility and his belief in American ideals.